Have you ever driven past an abandoned motel on a lonely highway and felt a chill run down your spine? Those faded signs and boarded windows, what secrets might they be keeping? The Sundown Motel in Bakersfield, California, stood for decades as just another roadside relic, until a routine demolition uncovered a truth so horrifying that it challenged everything investigators thought they knew about a case that had gone cold more than 70 years ago. Before we continue with this disturbing story, please take a moment to comment where you're watching from. Your support and subscriptions are what allow us to continue bringing these forgotten chapters of darkness to light. This channel depends on your help to keep uncovering these hidden stories that some would prefer stay buried forever. On the morning of June 17, 1952, the Sundown Motel on Route 66 was a bustling establishment catering to weary travelers seeking respite from the California heat. By midnight, Room 17 would become a sealed tomb of ash, smoke, and secrets, a mystery that would perplex investigators for 7 decades. The Bakersfield Fire Department received the call at 11:47 p.m. By the time they arrived, flames had already consumed most of the western wing of the motel. The fire chief at the time, Harold Burnett, would later describe the blaze as unusual in its ferocity and containment. Unlike most motel fires, which typically spread rapidly from room to room, this fire had remained almost entirely confined to Room 17, burning with such intensity that it melted the metal doorframe and reduced the furniture to unrecognizable lumps of carbon. Once the flames were extinguished, firefighters made a grim discovery. Among the debris were 2 bodies, burned beyond recognition. Dental records would later identify one of the victims as Eleanor Mitchell, a 32-year-old secretary from San Francisco who had checked into the motel alone earlier that day. The second victim, a male approximately 40 years old, remained unidentified. He had not been registered as a guest. The scene didn't make sense from the beginning, recalled Detective Philip Gaines in a 1971 interview shortly before his retirement. The door was locked from the inside, the windows were closed, and there was no evidence of forced entry. Yet something had turned that room into an inferno hot enough to warp steel. And why was there a man with Mrs. Mitchell who wasn't on any guest registry? Initial reports labeled the incident a tragic accident, perhaps a cigarette dropped on the bed or faulty wiring in the aging building. The case was filed away, becoming just another statistic in the archives of the Bakersfield Police Department. Eleanor Mitchell's husband, Richard Mitchell, a prominent banker in San Francisco, collected the insurance money and remarried less than a year later. The motel, after repairing the damaged wing, continued operating until 1983, when declining business forced its closure. For 70 years, the truth remained sealed behind police tape and bureaucratic indifference, until 3 months ago, when demolition crews, preparing to tear down the derelict motel, made a discovery that would reopen the case and reveal a horror far more deliberate than anyone had imagined. I was checking the structural integrity of the foundation when I noticed something odd in the concrete beneath Room 17, said Carlos Reyes, the demolition foreman. There was a seam that didn't match the building plans. When we broke through, we found a small metal box that had been sealed inside the foundation. It must have been placed there during renovations after the fire. The contents of that box, a bundle of charred love letters, a melted gold pocket watch, and most disturbingly, a handwritten confession, would finally provide answers to the questions that had surrounded the Sundown Motel fire for 7 decades. The confession, written on heat-damaged stationery bearing the letterhead of the First National Bank of San Francisco, was signed by Richard Mitchell, Eleanor's husband. In 5 pages of meticulous detail, Richard described how he had discovered his wife's affair with Thomas Blackwood, the bank's vice president. The betrayal had sent him into what he described as a darkness from which I could not emerge. I followed Eleanor to Bakersfield, Richard wrote. I watched her check into the motel alone, and then I waited. When Thomas arrived 3 hours later, I knew my suspicions had been confirmed. I waited another 2 hours until the motel office had closed for the night and most of the guests had retired to their rooms. Then I approached room 17. What happened next reveals a calculated cruelty that transcends mere jealous rage. According to his confession, Richard had been planning his revenge for weeks. He had acquired a particular chemical compound from a mining contact, a substance used in industrial applications that, when exposed to air, creates an extreme exothermic reaction. He had modified the compound to delay its activation and disguised it as a gift box of chocolates. I knocked on the door and identified myself as room service. The confession continued. When Thomas opened the door, I could see Eleanor in the background, her face frozen in shock. Before either could react, I threw the package into the room and slammed the door shut, using a custom-made bracket to jam the lock from the outside. The gift box would have begun smoking within minutes, releasing both the incendiary compound and a powerful sedative gas I had added to ensure they would not be able to escape. Richard described waiting outside, listening to the muffled sounds of panic as the chemical reaction began, followed by silence as the sedative took effect. He admitted to watching from across the parking lot as the room erupted into flames, the fire so intense that it melted the metal fixtures while remaining largely contained to room 17 due to the motel's cinder block construction between units. When the fire trucks arrived, I was already on the highway back to San Francisco, he wrote. By morning, I was at my desk at the bank, accepting condolences for a tragedy I had orchestrated. Thomas was reported as missing, presumed to have left on an unannounced business trip. No one ever connected him to the unidentified body. The most disturbing aspect of Richard's confession was not the calculated nature of the murder, but what came after. He detailed how he had used his influence at the bank to ensure the investigation remained superficial, even paying off a local fire inspector to classify the blaze as accidental. He described collecting Eleanor's life insurance with a performance of grief that should have earned me recognition from the Motion Picture Academy. Most chillingly, he recounted how he had kept a small piece of melted glass from the motel room as a souvenir, which he would hold in his pocket during board meetings attended by Thomas Blackwood's widow. But why? After nearly 7 decades of silence, did Richard Mitchell feel compelled to document his crime? The answer came in the final paragraph of his confession. I am writing this in 1976, as the doctors tell me I have months to live. Cancer is consuming me from within, much like the fire consumed them. Yet something far worse than physical pain has afflicted me these past 24 years. Every night since that evening in Bakersfield, I have dreamed of room 17. In my dreams, the fire never fully consumes them. They remain conscious, burning eternally, their eyes fixed on me with perfect recognition. They know I am watching. They know I cannot leave. And recently, they have begun to speak to me, promising that they have prepared a place for me where I am going. I seal this confession in the foundations of where it happened, a truth buried in concrete, just as I have tried to bury it in my mind. Perhaps someone will find it after I am gone. Perhaps then they will understand that the true hell was not what I created for them, but what I created for myself. Professor of Criminal Psychology at UCLA, Dr. Meredith Winters, notes that the confession exhibits classic signs of what she terms deferred guilt manifestation. It's not uncommon for perpetrators of calculated crimes to experience a psychological breaking point decades later, Dr. Winters explained. The human mind can compartmentalize trauma and guilt for extraordinary periods, but eventually the weight becomes too much to bear. In Richard Mitchell's case, his terminal diagnosis likely removed the last barrier of self-preservation, allowing the full impact of his actions to surface in his consciousness. But the discovery of the confession box was only the beginning of the revelations. Once the case was reopened, investigators began to piece together a more complex picture of the events surrounding that night in 1952. Eleanor Mitchell, far from being merely a secretary involved in a simple affair, had been compiling evidence of significant financial irregularities at First National Bank. Archived records from the California Banking Commission revealed that Eleanor had scheduled a confidential meeting with banking regulators for the week following her death. Thomas Blackwood, as Vice President of Loans, would have had access to the very records Eleanor was investigating. We now believe their meeting at the Sundown Motel may not have been romantic in nature at all, said Special Agent Diana Harding of the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division. Based on documents recovered from Eleanor Mitchell's personal effects, which had been stored in the bank's archives, it appears she had uncovered evidence of a major embezzlement scheme involving several high-ranking bank officials, including her husband. According to these documents, Richard Mitchell had been diverting significant sums from wealthy clients' accounts into offshore holdings, using his position of trust to conduct one of the largest banking frauds of the era. Thomas Blackwood, rather than being Eleanor's lover, may have been the only other bank executive aware of the scheme who was willing to help her expose it. The narrative of the unfaithful wife and the jealous husband provided the perfect cover, Agent Harding explained. It directed the investigation away from financial motives and ensured that no one looked too closely at the bank's records. By the time anyone might have noticed the missing funds, Richard had already used his position to conceal the evidence. This revelation casts the events at the Sundown Motel in an even more sinister light. Richard Mitchell didn't just commit a crime of passion, he executed a calculated elimination of two people who threatened to expose his criminal activities, while simultaneously creating a narrative that would ensure no one looked beyond the apparent tragedy of a love triangle gone wrong. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this newly solved cold case lies in what happened after Richard Mitchell sealed his confession in the concrete foundation of Room 17. According to records from Providence Hospital in San Francisco, Richard Mitchell did indeed die of pancreatic cancer in early 1977, just months after writing his confession. Hospital staff noted unusual complications during his final days, specifically unexplained burn-like lesions that appeared on his skin despite no exposure to heat sources or caustic chemicals. His night nurse, Gloria Jenkins, documented his increasingly agitated sleep state. "He would wake up screaming about the same thing every night," she wrote in her notes. He claimed there were two people standing at the foot of his bed, their skin blackened and cracked, with flames visible in the fissures. He said they were reaching for him, telling him it was time to check in. The night of Richard Mitchell's death, hospital staff reported an unusual occurrence. Despite it being January, the temperature in his room rose so dramatically that it triggered the sprinkler system. When staff entered the flooded room, they found Mitchell deceased, his body contorted in what the attending physician described as a position of absolute terror. Most disturbing were the reports from multiple staff members who claimed that for several seconds they detected the strong smell of smoke and burning flesh, though no fire was present. The case of the Sundown Motel fire stands as a grim reminder of how justice, though delayed, finds its path through time. The demolition of the motel, scheduled for completion next month, has been temporarily halted as investigators continue to examine the site for any additional evidence. Local residents have reported unusual phenomena around the property, particularly near the remains of Room 17. "I was driving past at night last week, and I swear I saw lights on in that room," said local resident Marlene Cooper. "Not just any lights. It looked like something was on fire in there. But when I looked again, it was dark. The whole place has been without power for decades. Others have reported hearing screams coming from the empty building or seeing two figures standing in the window of room 17, their forms silhouetted against an orange glow that seems to come from within the abandoned structure. Police have dismissed these reports as the product of imagination fueled by the recent publicity surrounding the case. Yet the question remains: did Richard Mitchell's guilt manifest purely in his mind, or was there something more reaching out to him from beyond conventional understanding? The confession speaks of dreams where his victims burned eternally, conscious and aware. What if those weren't dreams at all, but glimpses of something that transcends our understanding of death and punishment? Dr. Elias Monroe, a parapsychologist who has studied cases of reported hauntings at sites of violent deaths, offers this perspective. Locations where extreme trauma and intense emotions occurred can sometimes retain an imprint of those events. In cases like the Sundown Motel, where victims died in a state of terror and betrayal, that energy may be particularly potent. If Richard Mitchell returned to the site to conceal his confession, he may have reopened a connection to whatever remained of his victim's consciousness. Whether one believes in such supernatural possibilities or not, the documented facts of Richard Mitchell's final days, the unexplained burns, the extreme heat in his hospital room, his terror at seeing figures that couldn't possibly be there, suggest that perhaps in some way Eleanor Mitchell and Thomas Blackwood finally found a way to deliver their own form of justice. As demolition preparations continue, workers have reported equipment malfunctions, particularly around room 17. Power tools inexplicably overheat. Digital devices fail. 3 workers have quit after experiencing what they described as severe burning sensations on their skin when attempting to remove materials from near the foundation where the confession was found. "I'm not saying I believe in ghosts," demolition foreman Carlos Reyes said, "but there's something not right about that room. Even after all these years, when you stand in there, it feels hot, like the fire never really went out." The current owner of the property, development company Westridge Partners, has proceeded with caution, bringing in both engineering experts and, at the suggestion of some workers, a local priest to bless the site before demolition resumes. "We respect the history of the location," said Westridge spokesperson Jennifer Lamont. "Whatever happened there in 1952 was a tragedy. We just want to ensure that when the building finally comes down, whatever energy might be attached to it finds peace." For the families of Eleanor Mitchell and Thomas Blackwood, the discovery of Richard Mitchell's confession has brought long-delayed answers, but little comfort. Eleanor's niece, Catherine Winters, now in her 70s, was just a child when her aunt died. "My mother, Eleanor's sister, never believed it was an accident," Catherine said. "She always told me that Aunt Eleanor was too careful, too methodical for that. To finally know the truth after all these years, it confirms what our family suspected, but it also opens old wounds. I only wish my mother had lived to see Richard's guilt exposed." Thomas Blackwood's grandson, Michael Blackwood, expressed similar sentiments. "My father grew up never knowing what happened to his father. The family was told he had abandoned them, gone off to start a new life somewhere. That shadow hung over our family for generations. To learn that he may have been trying to do the right thing, that he died because of it. It changes how we see our own history. As night falls over the remains of the Sundown Motel, one can't help but wonder what still lingers in room 17. The physical evidence of Richard Mitchell's crime has long since been catalogued and stored away in evidence lockers. The confession that broke open the case sits in a climate-controlled room at FBI headquarters. Yet something remains at the site itself, something that workers feel, that passers-by glimpse, that makes the air around that particular room feel charged with an energy that 7 decades have not diminished. If you park across the street after dark, locals say, and watch the ruins of the motel long enough, You might see a brief flare of orange light in the window of room 17. It lasts only a moment, but in that instant, some claim to see two figures silhouetted against the glow. They stand perfectly still, facing outward, as if watching, waiting for something or someone. Perhaps it is merely the power of suggestion playing tricks on the mind. Perhaps it is nothing more than headlights from passing cars reflecting off the few remaining fragments of glass. Or perhaps, as Richard Mitchell wrote in his final confession, some hells are of our own making, some fires never fully extinguish, and some debts transcend even death itself. The case of the Sundown Motel fire is officially solved. The truth of what happened that night in 1952 has finally been uncovered. But for those who have stood near room 17, who have felt the unnatural warmth that still emanates from its foundations, who have heard the whispers that seem to rise with the desert wind around the abandoned building, one question remains. Can a case truly be closed when those involved refuse to rest? Eleanor Mitchell and Thomas Blackwood died seeking justice. Richard Mitchell died fearing retribution. As the motel that became their tomb prepares to finally crumble to dust, one wonders if the cycle of vengeance that began on that June night will at last be broken, or if it will simply take new form, finding new vessels for an anger that burns eternal. For now, room 17 stands as a monument to delayed justice, a reminder that some truths cannot remain buried forever, and that perhaps, in ways we cannot fully comprehend, those who have passed still seek resolution for wrongs that the living have forgotten. The truth of the Sundown Motel has emerged from concrete and ash after 70 years. But truth and justice are not always the same thing. And in the darkness of room 17, as demolition crews prepare to erase it from existence, something still burns, still watches, still waits. In the heart of Bakersfield, amid the rush of progress and development, the remains of the Sundown Motel have become a silent testament to the persistence of memory and the long reach of consequences. Soon, it will be gone, replaced by modern construction that will erase all physical traces of what occurred there. But for those who know the story, who have felt the residual heat of that decades-old fire, the question persists: can we ever truly demolish the past? As Richard Mitchell discovered in his final days, sometimes the most terrifying realization is that what we think we've escaped has been patiently waiting for us all along. The investigation into the financial crimes connected to the case continues, with FBI forensic accountants now examining records from First National Bank that had been sealed since the 1950s. The full extent of Richard Mitchell's embezzlement scheme may never be known, as many records have been lost to time, and the bank itself was absorbed by larger institutions through a series of mergers in the 1980s. What is known, however, is that several wealthy clients of the bank reported significant financial losses in the years following 1952. These complaints were quietly settled out of court, with the details sealed by confidentiality agreements. The timing of these settlements corresponds with Richard Mitchell's rapid accumulation of personal wealth and property in the decade after Eleanor's death. He essentially got away with both murder and massive financial fraud, Agent Harding noted. He used one crime to cover the other, and the social conventions of the era worked in his favor. A banking executive's word carried tremendous weight, and few would have believed a woman's secretary over him, especially after her death had been ruled accidental and she couldn't defend her findings. This aspect of the case has drawn attention from historians and sociologists who study gender dynamics in mid-century corporate America. Dr. Lydia Farnsworth, author of Silence Voices, Women Whistleblowers in Post-War America, sees Eleanor Mitchell's story as emblematic of a broader pattern. Women who attempted to expose wrongdoing in corporate environments during this period faced tremendous obstacles, Dr. Farnsworth explained. They were often dismissed as hysterical, attention-seeking, or having personal vendettas. Eleanor Mitchell's attempt to work with Thomas Blackwood to find a male ally who might legitimize her concerns reflects the strategic compromises women had to make to be taken seriously. That both paid with their lives illustrates the extreme risks whistleblowers faced, especially when those they exposed had power and resources. The revelation that Thomas Blackwood may have been a potential ally rather than a lover has sparked a re-examination of other deaths connected to banking scandals of the era. Investigators are now looking into at least 3 other cases from the 1950s where bank employees died under questionable circumstances shortly before regulatory investigations were scheduled. Meanwhile, at the site of the Sundown Motel, the unusual phenomena continue. Last Tuesday, a security guard hired to patrol the property quit after a single night on duty. He reported hearing what sounded like a man and woman arguing, coming from room 17, followed by a sound like gas igniting and then screaming. When he investigated, he found the room empty and significantly colder than the surrounding areas, the opposite of what other witnesses had reported. Local paranormal investigation groups have requested permission to conduct research at the site before demolition resumes. Westridge Partners has declined these requests, citing liability concerns, but has agreed to allow a documentary crew to film the final demolition process for a special about the case that will air next fall on a major streaming platform. The unexpected turns in the Sundown Motel case have captivated the public imagination, inspiring discussions about how crimes of the past continue to resonate in the present. True crime podcasts have dedicated episodes to the story, focusing particularly on the psychological aspects of Richard Mitchell's delayed confession and reported supernatural experiences. Dr. Monroe, the parapsychologist, suggests that such cases represent unfinished business that transcends conventional understanding of life and death. In traditions around the world, we find the concept that souls who have experienced violent or unjust deaths may remain tethered to the physical world until some form of resolution occurs, he said. The discovery of Richard's confession, the exposure of his crimes, the vindication of Eleanor and Thomas, these developments may create the conditions for whatever energy remains at the Sundown Motel to finally dissipate. Others remain skeptical, attributing the reported phenomena to a combination of suggestion, imagination, and natural explanations. Dr. Rebecca Chen, a geologist who has studied the area, notes that the land beneath the motel sits near a minor fault line that can produce localized temperature variations and subtle vibrations that might be misinterpreted as paranormal activity. When people know the history of a location, they're primed to interpret ambiguous stimuli in ways that confirm the narrative they're expecting, Dr. Chen explained. A random temperature fluctuation becomes a cold spot. The sound of settling foundations becomes voices. It's a fascinating example of how our expectations shape our perceptions. Yet even Dr. Chen admits to feeling unsettled during her brief examination of room 17. "I'm not saying there's anything supernatural happening there," she said, "but there is something atmospheric about that space. A heaviness that's difficult to articulate in scientific terms. Perhaps the most poignant perspective comes from Margaret Blackwood, Thomas Blackwood's 93-year-old widow, who still lives in an assisted living facility in Sacramento. When informed about the discoveries at the Sundown Motel and the new understanding of her husband's disappearance, she received the news with quiet dignity. "I always knew Thomas would never have abandoned us," she said in a brief statement released through her grandson. "He was a man of principle. To learn that he died trying to expose wrongdoing doesn't surprise me at all. It's who he was." When asked about the reports of unusual occurrences at the motel, Mrs. Blackwood simply smiled. "Thomas never could leave a job unfinished," she said. "If there's still work to be done, he'll see it through." As the legal and historical implications of the case continue to unfold, the physical remnants of the Sundown Motel stand in limbo, no longer simply an abandoned building awaiting demolition, but a site of active investigation and profound cultural significance. Local officials are now considering whether to preserve Room 17 as a historical landmark, sealing it rather than destroying it. There's educational value in preservation, argued Bakersfield Historical Society President Martin Green. This case touches on banking history, gender dynamics in the workplace, the limitations of mid-century forensic techniques, and yes, the human fascination with the possibility that emotional energy might somehow transcend death. It's a unique nexus of historical threads that deserves to be remembered. Others in the community strongly disagree. "That place needs to come down," said longtime resident Shirley Dawson, whose grandmother worked as a maid at the Sundown in the 1960s. "My grandma wouldn't go near Room 17, said it made her skin crawl. Some things shouldn't be preserved. They should be put to rest." As debate continues about the future of the physical structure, the story of what happened there has already secured its place in the complex tapestry of American true crime history. The case of Eleanor Mitchell and Thomas Blackwood, their deaths, the decades of mystery, Richard Mitchell's tormented confession, and the final revelations that transformed understanding of the events, serves as a reminder that justice, while sometimes delayed, finds its way through the corridors of time. For now, the ruins of the Sundown Motel remain, its empty windows like vacant eyes staring out at a world that has changed dramatically since that fiery night in 1952. Room 17, where it all happened, still stands, a hollow space filled with echoes of the past, where three lives converged in flame and betrayal, setting in motion a sequence of consequences that would take 7 decades to fully manifest. As night falls over Bakersfield, the occasional passing car might slow near the abandoned motel, its occupants peering through the darkness at the derelict building where 2 souls were trapped in fire by a man who thought he had committed the perfect crime. Some say they see the flicker of flames in the window of Room 17. Others report feeling watched as they drive by. Most simply feel a sense of melancholy, a recognition that within those crumbling walls something irreparable occurred, something that 7 decades have not healed. Perhaps when the building finally comes down, whatever lingers there will find peace. Perhaps Eleanor Mitchell and Thomas Blackwood, their names finally cleared, their true purposes revealed, will at last rest. Or perhaps, as some locals believe, their story is not yet complete, the final chapter still waiting to be written in flames that burn without consuming, in justice that reaches beyond the grave. What remains certain is that the case of the Sundown Motel fire has permanently altered how many view the boundary between past and present, between justice delayed and justice denied, between what can be buried and what refuses to remain in darkness. In the words of Detective Philip Gaines, who first investigated the case and went to his grave never knowing the truth, "Some crimes leave marks that time cannot erase. Some victims refuse to be forgotten. And sometimes the most perfect crimes are the ones that ultimately destroy those who commit them." As you consider the story of the Sundown Motel, of Eleanor Mitchell and Thomas Blackwood, and the man who thought he had silenced them forever, remember that perhaps the most terrifying aspect of this tale is not the possibility of restless spirits or justice from beyond the grave. Perhaps what should truly unsettle us is how easily truth can be buried, how effectively power can silence those who would expose it, and how many similar stories might still lie undiscovered, waiting beneath concrete and ash for someone to finally bring them into the light. The morning after Richard Mitchell sealed his confession in the concrete beneath Room 17 of the Sundown Motel, he returned to San Francisco feeling a weight had been lifted. For 24 years, he had carried the burden of his crimes, watching as his wealth grew and his reputation remained untarnished. Now, with death approaching, he had unburdened himself in the only way he could, by leaving the truth where it had all happened, to be discovered long after he was gone, What Richard couldn't have anticipated was how quickly his act of confession would alter his reality. That very night, as he lay in his expansive Pacific Heights mansion, the dreams that had plagued him for decades intensified. No longer were Eleanor and Thomas simply watching him from within the flames. Now they were moving, stepping out of the fire, approaching his bedside with methodical purpose. "They spoke to me," Richard later told his private physician, Dr. Samuel Hawkins. "Not in voices exactly, but I could hear them in my mind. They said they had been waiting for me to acknowledge what I'd done. They said now that I had, they could come for me." Dr. Hawkins diagnosed these experiences as hallucinations brought on by the combination of advanced cancer, pain medication, and the psychological strain of terminal illness. He increased Richard's sedative dosage and arranged for 24-hour nursing care. Yet the medications seemed to have little effect on Richard's nocturnal visitations. Nancy Ellis, one of the nurses assigned to Richard's care, kept detailed notes on his deteriorating condition, notes that would later become evidence in the reopened investigation. "Mr. Mitchell refuses to sleep at night," she wrote on November 12, 1976. "He insists on keeping every light in the room on and becomes agitated if left alone for even a few minutes. He continually checks the temperature, complaining that the room is becoming hotter despite the thermostat reading normal. Most concerning are the marks appearing on his skin, raised, reddened areas that resemble first-degree burns. These appear overnight, with no apparent cause." Dr. Hawkins initially suspected that Richard might be self-inflicting these injuries, perhaps due to guilt manifesting physically. He ordered soft restraints for nighttime use, ostensibly to prevent Richard from harming himself, but primarily to test whether the mysterious burns would still appear when Richard couldn't reach his own skin. They did. The marks appeared across his chest and arms, Nancy noted on November 15th. Perfect handprints, as if someone had pressed burning palms against his skin. Mr. Mitchell became hysterical when he saw them, screaming that they had touched him and that he could smell their burning flesh when they came close. By late November, Richard's condition had deteriorated to the point where Dr. Hawkins recommended hospitalization. The cancer had spread to his liver and bones, causing excruciating pain that even morphine could barely touch. Yet Richard resisted leaving his home. "He told me that the only thing keeping them at bay was that he was not in a place that resembled a motel room," Nancy recalled in a later interview. "He was terrified that a hospital room, with its single bed, basic furniture and door that closed him in, would be too similar to room 17. He said they were just waiting for him to enter a space like that." Despite his protests, Richard's medical needs eventually necessitated admission to Providence Hospital on December 3rd. Nancy Ellis, having developed a rapport with her difficult patient, arranged to continue as his primary night nurse at the hospital. Her notes from those final weeks provide the most comprehensive documentation of the inexplicable phenomena surrounding Richard Mitchell's final days. December 5th. Patient extremely agitated upon admission. Keeps asking about the room number. Seems relieved when told he's in room 412. Requested a detailed inspection of the bathroom, specifically asking me to check if the shower curtain is plastic or fabric. When I told him it was cloth, he visibly relaxed. December 8th. Temperature anomalies continue. Hospital maintenance has checked the heating system 3 times, finding no malfunctions, yet the temperature in Mr. Mitchell's room climbs to nearly 80 degrees in the middle of the night, while adjacent rooms remain normal. December 12th. Patient reported seeing smoke coming from the bathroom at approximately 3:15 a.m. When I checked, there was no smoke visible, but the bathroom was significantly warmer than the main room, and there was a distinct odor that I can only describe as similar to burned hair and kerosene. Maintenance found no issues with any equipment or wiring. December 15th. The burn marks are appearing with increasing frequency. Dr. Hawkins has consulted with 3 dermatologists, none of whom can explain the patterns. They appear suddenly, often while I'm in the room, with no apparent cause. Today, while changing his sheets, I observed 5 small circular burns form on his forearm in a pattern resembling fingerprints. Mr. Mitchell was sedated at the time and could not have caused them himself. As Christmas approached, Richard Mitchell's lucidity began to fade. He drifted between consciousness and a state that resembled sleep, but was marked by continuous murmuring and physical responses to stimuli only he could perceive. The few coherent statements he made during this period focused almost exclusively on fire, room 17, and his certainty that Eleanor and Thomas were preparing something for him. On December 23rd, he experienced a brief period of startling clarity. He asked for paper and a pen, and with trembling hands wrote an addendum to his original confession. This document, which Nancy Ellis preserved, offers a disturbing glimpse into Richard Mitchell's final understanding of his situation. I now see that what I wrote and sealed away in the foundation of that cursed room was not the end, but the beginning, he wrote. By acknowledging my crimes, I did not free myself from them. I opened a door. They have been patient all these years. The fire that was meant to consume them instead transformed them. They are not ghosts. They are not spirits. They are something forged in the flames of my own making, and they have been refining their purpose for 24 years. Tonight they showed me what awaits, not hell as I was taught to fear as a child. No lake of fire, no demons with pitchforks. Something far more intimate. They have created a place that exists at the intersection of memory and eternity, a single room perfectly preserved in the moment when the flames were at their height. A room where the fire burns continuously but consumes nothing, where the pain is exquisite and awareness is heightened rather than diminished, where time has no meaning except as an endless expansion of the present. They have kept this place for me. They have tended it like gardeners, feeding it with their own suffering and with my growing fear. And soon, I feel it approaching like a wave about to break. They will take me there. Not my body, which the cancer has already claimed, but whatever essence it is that makes me myself, that knows what I have done, that can feel remorse and terror. That is what they want. That is what they have always wanted. Nancy Ellis found this document on Richard's bedside table the morning of December 24th. She included it with her notes, but did not share its contents with Dr. Hawkins or the other hospital staff, later explaining that she feared being removed from Richard's care if she seemed to be encouraging what they all viewed as delusions. "I didn't believe in ghosts or eternal punishment," she said in a 2010 interview. "But I had seen too many inexplicable things in that room to dismiss his experiences entirely. Something was happening to Richard Mitchell that medicine couldn't explain and science couldn't measure. I wanted to document it fully, without interference." Christmas Eve brought the most dramatic manifestations yet. Hospital orderly Marcus Jackson, bringing dinner to room 412, reported hearing 2 voices coming from inside, one male, one female, though Nancy Ellis had stepped out and Richard was alone. When Marcus entered, he found the room unoccupied, except for Richard, who was staring at the foot of his bed with an expression of absolute terror. "The weird thing wasn't just that I heard voices when there was nobody there," Marcus later told investigators. "It was that the voices stopped mid-sentence when I opened the door, like when you interrupt a private conversation. And the look on the old man's face. He wasn't confused or disoriented like patients sometimes get. He was completely lucid, completely aware, and completely terrified." That night, multiple staff members reported hearing what sounded like an intense argument coming from room 412, though when anyone entered, they found only Richard, sometimes responsive, sometimes locked in what appeared to be a catatonic state. The night supervisor, Judith Chen, made the decision to move Richard to a different room after a patient across the hall complained about the smell of smoke coming from his room. But no other rooms were available in the oncology ward. Nancy Ellis arrived for her shift at 11 p.m. to find Richard more animated than he had been in days. Despite his physical weakness, he was attempting to get out of bed, insisting that he needed to get away from here before midnight. He kept saying, "They told me how it works. At midnight the barrier will be thinnest. They can reach across fully and take me back with them," Nancy recalled. I tried to calm him, but for the first time in our relationship he seemed afraid of me. He asked repeatedly if I was really me, or if I was one of them wearing your face. As midnight approached, Nancy documented a series of escalating anomalies. The room temperature began to rise dramatically. Electronic equipment malfunctioned. The television turned on and off repeatedly, displaying only static. The lights flickered in a rhythmic pattern. The electronic monitors tracking Richard's vital signs showed impossible readings before shutting down completely. Most disturbing was Richard's physical transformation. The burn marks that had appeared sporadically over previous weeks now began to spread across his visible skin in an accelerating pattern. Nancy described them as flowing like water across his arms, neck and face. Richard, despite his weakened state, became increasingly agitated, alternating between attempts to flee the room and periods of absolute stillness, during which he appeared to be listening to voices only he could hear. At 11:55, Nancy stepped into the hallway to call for assistance. She was gone less than 30 seconds, but when she returned, she found the room transformed. Though the building's heating system had been thoroughly checked and was functioning normally in all other areas, the temperature in room 412 had risen to over 90 degrees. A fine mist hung in the air, not smoke, but something that Nancy described as similar to the heat distortion you see rising from hot pavement in summer. Richard was awake and alert, sitting upright in bed for the first time in days without assistance. He was staring at the foot of the bed, his expression no longer showing fear, but a strange, resigned recognition. "They're here," he said to Nancy, though his eyes never left whatever he perceived at the foot of the bed. "They've kept their promise, and I deserve what comes next." Nancy, following her medical training despite her growing unease, approached the bed to check Richard's pulse. She later described what happened next. "The heat was incredible, like opening an oven door. As I touched his wrist, I felt a sensation like static electricity, but much stronger, a current that seemed to flow from him into me. And in that moment, I saw them too, just for a second, but with perfect clarity. A man and a woman, standing side by side at the foot of the bed. Their clothing and hair were intact, normal, but their skin was blackened and cracked, with a red-orange glow visible in the fissures, like there was fire inside them. They weren't speaking, but they were extending their hands toward Richard, palms up in a gesture that was almost ceremonial, an invitation. Nancy pulled her hand away from Richard, breaking the connection and losing sight of the figures. Richard, however, continued to stare at the foot of the bed. The wall clock read 11:59. "It's time," Richard said. "Room 17 is waiting for me." At precisely midnight, according to Nancy's account, several things happened simultaneously. The temperature in the room spiked so dramatically that the fire suppression system activated, sending sprays of water from the ceiling. Every light in the room burst, sending glass shards across the floor. And Richard Mitchell, terminal cancer patient with perhaps days to live, arched his back in a position that medical experts later testified would be impossible for someone in his debilitated condition. His mouth open in what Nancy described as not a scream of pain, but an expression of awful recognition. By the time other hospital staff reached the flooded room, Richard Mitchell was dead. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, though the examining physician noted the unusual pattern of burn-like lesions covering approximately 70% of the body, as well as the extreme contortion of the corpse, which required special handling for placement in the morgue. Most puzzling to the medical examiner was the condition of Richard's eyes. "The corneal burns and retinal damage," wrote Dr. William Foster, "are consistent with someone who has stared directly into an extremely bright light source, such as an arc welder's torch, without protective equipment. There was no such light source in the hospital room." In the confusion following Richard's death, Nancy Ellis's detailed notes might have been lost or dismissed as the observations of an overworked nurse dealing with a difficult patient. However, Nancy had taken the precaution of making copies, one of which she sent to her sister for safekeeping. She continued working at Providence Hospital until her retirement in 1998, though she requested never to be assigned to room 412 again. The room, coincidentally or not, was converted to a storage closet after 3 subsequent patients reported experiences similar to Richard's, including dramatic temperature fluctuations and vivid nightmares involving fire. These accounts might have remained nothing more than unusual footnotes in medical files and hospital gossip, if not for the discovery, 49 years later, of Richard Mitchell's original confession in the foundations of the Sundown Motel. When that document came to light, Nancy Ellis's meticulous records suddenly transformed from curious anecdotes to potentially crucial evidence in understanding the full scope of the case. Dr. Monroe, the parapsychologist who has studied the Sundown Motel case, sees significant patterns in the experiences reported by both Richard Mitchell and the witnesses to his final hours. What's particularly interesting from a research perspective is the consistency of the manifestations across both locations, the motel and the hospital room, despite being separated by hundreds of miles, Dr. Monroe explained. The temperature anomalies, the visible figures with the distinctive fire within appearance, the smell of smoke where no fire existed, these details appear in accounts from multiple witnesses who had no knowledge of each other's experiences. This kind of consistency across independent testimonies is what we look for when assessing the validity of reported paranormal phenomena. For Dr. Winters, the criminal psychologist, the case represents a fascinating intersection of criminal justice, psychological deterioration, and possibly something beyond current scientific understanding. Richard Mitchell committed what he believed was the perfect crime, Dr. Winters observed. He eliminated the people who threatened to expose his financial fraud, created a narrative of accidental death that diverted suspicion, and built a new life of wealth and respectability on the foundation of these murders. In psychological terms, we would expect the weight of such actions to manifest eventually, what we call deferred guilt response. But the specific way his guilt manifested with such consistent and physically verifiable elements challenges purely psychological explanations. The question that continues to intrigue investigators and researchers is whether Richard Mitchell's experiences and those of the witnesses around him were the product of a guilty mind, creating increasingly elaborate self-punishment, or whether something more was at work. Could Eleanor Mitchell and Thomas Blackwood have somehow reached across the divide between life and death to claim a justice that earthly authorities had failed to deliver? For Margaret Blackwood, Thomas's widow, the question has a clear answer. When shown Nancy Ellis's accounts of Richard Mitchell's final days, the elderly woman nodded slowly, a faint smile crossing her face. "Thomas was a patient man," she said. "When we were young, he would spend hours solving complex puzzles, never rushing, never giving up until each piece was perfectly placed. If he needed to wait 24 years to complete his final task, he would do so without complaint." Asked if she believed her husband's spirit had somehow orchestrated Richard Mitchell's terrifying end, Margaret replied simply, "I believe in justice. Sometimes it works through the courts, sometimes through conscience, and sometimes, perhaps, through other means we don't fully comprehend." For Catherine Winters, Eleanor Mitchell's niece, the supernatural elements of the case are less important than the vindication of her aunt's character and purpose. My family carried the burden of uncertainty for generations, she said. Was Aunt Eleanor careless? Was she unfaithful to her husband? Had she somehow brought about her own death through poor judgment? Now we know the truth. She was a woman of principle who discovered serious wrongdoing and was killed for trying to expose it. Whether or not her spirit somehow brought her killer to justice is less important to me than having her true character and actions recognized after all these years. As the Sundown Motel case continues to unfold in the courts, with investigations into the financial crimes still ongoing and potential posthumous legal actions against Richard Mitchell's estate being considered, the question of what really happened in Room 17 on that June night in 1952 has been answered. The question of what happened in Room 412 of Providence Hospital on Christmas Eve, 1976, remains more ambiguous. What is certain is that Richard Mitchell, a man who used fire to silence those who threatened to expose him, spent his final hours apparently experiencing the very fate he had inflicted on his victims. Whether this was the product of psychological deterioration, as conventional science would suggest, or something that transcends current understanding of life, death, and justice, depends largely on one's willingness to consider possibilities beyond the boundaries of established knowledge. For those directly touched by the case, the distinction may be academic. Eleanor Mitchell and Thomas Blackwood, their names cleared and their true purposes revealed, have achieved a form of justice that transcends criminal prosecution. Richard Mitchell, despite escaping legal consequences during his lifetime, appears to have faced a reckoning of his own making, or perhaps of theirs. The Sundown Motel itself stands as the final piece of the puzzle. As demolition preparations continue, those who work at the site continue to report unusual experiences, particularly around Room 17. The demolition foreman, Carlos Reyes, maintains special procedures for work near that location. "We don't send anyone to work there alone," he explained, "and we try to finish any necessary work before sundown. It might sound superstitious, but after what happened to the first crew, well, better safe than sorry." The first crew Reyes refers to was a team of 3 workers who were assigned to remove fixtures from Room 17 in preparation for demolition. All 3 men were hospitalized after suffering what medical reports described as severe heat exhaustion and first-degree burns, despite the cool weather and their limited physical exertion. Most puzzling to doctors were the burn patterns, specifically handprint-shaped marks on their wrists and forearms, as if they had been grabbed by someone with burning hot hands. All 3 workers refused to return to the site. One of them, James Martinez, agreed to speak about his experience on condition of anonymity, a condition we are respecting by changing his name. "I was removing the old sink from the bathroom when I felt like someone was watching me," Martinez said. "I turned around expecting to see one of my co-workers, but the room was empty. That's when I noticed how hot it had gotten. It was maybe 55 degrees outside, but in that room it felt like 100. And there was this smell, like matches and something else. Something worse." Martinez described feeling a sudden pressure on his wrist, like someone grabbed me, hard, followed by intense pain. When he looked down, he saw the distinct impression of a hand forming on his skin, the flesh reddening and blistering as he watched. "I ran out of there yelling for help," he continued. "My buddies came running, but when they got to me, the same thing happened to them. It was like whatever was in there could reach out through me to them. We all got the hell out of there and went straight to the ER. Hospital records confirmed that all 3 men were treated for unusual burn patterns that medical staff could not readily explain. The attending physician noted that the injuries appeared to be thermal burns, but with distinct patterns suggesting direct contact with a heated object in the shape of a human hand. Such accounts have fueled speculation about the future of the Sundown Motel site. While Westridge Partners initially planned to demolish the structure entirely to make way for a new commercial development, they are now considering alternatives. We're exploring options that respect the historical and unique aspects of the location, said company spokesperson Jennifer Lamont. This might include preserving Room 17 as a sealed memorial while developing the rest of the property, or documenting the site extensively before proceeding with complete demolition. Local officials are divided on the best approach. Some, like Historical Society President Martin Green, advocate for preservation. This site has significance that transcends ordinary historical value, Green argued. It represents a nexus of historical, criminal, and potentially paranormal importance that deserves to be preserved for future study. Others, including several religious leaders from the community, have called for the building to be completely demolished and the ground blessed before any new construction begins. There are some places where the veil between worlds becomes thin, said Pastor David Williams of First Baptist Church. Whatever happened in that motel room created a wound in the fabric of this community that needs healing, not preservation. As debate continues, the ruins of the Sundown Motel have become something of a pilgrimage site for those interested in the case. Despite security measures, people regularly attempt to approach Room 17, drawn by the story and the possibility of experiencing something beyond ordinary reality. Most leave disappointed, having felt nothing unusual. But a few report experiences similar to those described by the workers: sudden heat, the smell of smoke and kerosene, the sensation of being watched, and in rare cases, the feeling of being touched by unseen hands. Dr. Munro cautions against such amateur investigations. If there is paranormal activity at this location, and I believe the evidence suggests there may be, it isn't a tourist attraction or a thrill ride. These phenomena appear to be connected to profound trauma and unresolved justice. They deserve respect, not exploitation. For law enforcement officials, the supernatural elements of the case remain secondary to the criminal aspects. FBI Special Agent Diana Harding continues to investigate the financial crimes connected to the murders, focusing particularly on identifying any potential accomplices or beneficiaries who might still be alive. While the primary perpetrator is long deceased, the money trail suggests that others may have known about or benefited from Mitchell's embezzlement scheme, Agent Harding explained. Financial crimes of this magnitude rarely involve just one person. There may still be individuals who helped conceal evidence or who inherited wealth that was essentially stolen from the bank's clients. This aspect of the investigation has led to a re-examination of Richard Mitchell's second marriage and business partnerships formed in the years following Eleanor's death. His widow, Vivian Mitchell, now in her 90s and living in a luxury retirement community in Palm Springs, has denied any knowledge of her late husband's crimes. Vivian Mitchell accumulated substantial wealth through her marriage to Richard, Agent Harding noted. While we have no evidence that she knew the source of that wealth was criminal, we are examining financial records to determine whether any of the embezzled funds might be recovered and returned to the families of the original victims. The legal complexities of pursuing financial remedies 7 decades after the crimes were committed present significant challenges. Many of the defrauded clients are deceased, their heirs difficult to trace. The banks involved have undergone multiple mergers and acquisitions, complicating questions of institutional liability. Yet for Catherine Winters and Michael Blackwood, representing the families of Eleanor and Thomas, the pursuit of justice transcends financial considerations. My aunt's reputation was tarnished for 70 years, Catherine said. She was portrayed as careless at best, immoral at worst. The truth that she died trying to expose significant financial crimes deserves to be officially recognized, regardless of whether any money is ever recovered. Michael Blackwood expressed similar sentiments. My grandfather was effectively erased, described as a missing person who had abandoned his family. His courage in supporting Eleanor's investigation cost him his life and his good name. That wrong needs to be corrected in the historical record. Both families have petitioned for formal, posthumous recognition of Eleanor Mitchell and Thomas Blackwood as early whistleblowers who paid the ultimate price for their integrity. Several financial ethics organizations have expressed interest in establishing scholarships or awards in their names. As the legal and historical aspects of the case continue to develop, the physical site of the Sundown Motel remains in limbo. Demolition has been temporarily halted pending further review, leaving the building in a state of suspended decay, a crumbling monument to secrets hidden for 7 decades. For those who pass by at night, the darkened structure stands as a reminder that some truths refuse to remain buried, that justice sometimes works through unexpected channels, and that the past is never as distant as we might wish to believe. Room 17, where it all began, sits empty now, its walls scarred by ancient fire, its foundation holding no more secrets. Yet according to those who have approached it, something still lingers there, something that remembers the betrayal and flames of a June night long ago. Whether one views the Sundown Motel case through the lens of criminal justice, psychological phenomena, or paranormal possibility, one truth remains clear. The actions we take, the choices we make, the wrongs we commit or try to right, these things leave imprints that time alone cannot erase. For Richard Mitchell, that lesson came too late, in a hospital room that transformed in his final moments into a mirror of the motel room where his crimes began. For the rest of us, perhaps the lesson lies in recognizing that consequences, like the truth itself, cannot be contained indefinitely. They find their way to the surface through concrete foundations, through decades of silence, through the barriers we erect between what we have done and what we wish to believe about ourselves. As demolition of the Sundown Motel resumes, or as preservation efforts establish it as a site of historical significance, one chapter of this story comes to a close. Yet for those who have been touched by the case, who have stood near Room 17 and felt its unnatural warmth, who have seen the evidence of inexplicable phenomena surrounding Richard Mitchell's final days, questions remain that may never find complete answers. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain partially unsolved, not as failures of investigation, but as reminders of the boundaries of our understanding. Perhaps Eleanor Mitchell and Thomas Blackwood, in death as in life, still have something to teach us about justice, perseverance, and the long arc of consequences that extends beyond what we can readily measure or explain. The fire that consumed them on that night in 1952 may have been extinguished by firefighters hours after it began. But something of that fire appears to have continued burning through the decades, a flame of unresolved justice that found its way eventually to the man who lit the match. As night falls once more over the ruins of the Sundown Motel, the windows of Room 17 remain dark. But those who watch carefully, locals say, might glimpse a momentary flicker of orange light, like a match being struck. It lasts only an instant before disappearing. Yet in that brief illumination, some claim to see 2 figures standing side by side, their forms outlined against the glow. They are watching, they are waiting. And perhaps, in ways we cannot fully comprehend, they are still seeking something that transcends our understanding of justice and retribution, some resolution that only they can define. The case of the Sundown Motel fire is officially solved. The truth is known. Yet something remains unfinished. A final chapter still being written in a language of flame and shadow, in a room that exists perhaps not just in the physical world, but in some liminal space where memory, justice, and eternity converge. For now, Room 17 stands as the last piece of a puzzle 7 decades in the solving, a space where fire once consumed 2 lives and created something that neither time nor death could fully extinguish. Soon it will be gone, its physical form erased by demolition or transformed by preservation efforts. But as Richard Mitchell discovered in his final moments, some rooms exist beyond their physical boundaries. Some fires continue to burn long after the flames have been extinguished, and some debts, once acknowledged, cannot be left unpaid. As this story reaches its conclusion, one question remains for those who hear it. If our actions create rooms in which we must eventually dwell, what spaces are we building for ourselves? When the time comes, what walls will surround us? What doors will close behind us, and who might be waiting inside? The answer, like justice itself, may be long delayed. But if the case of the Sundown Motel teaches us anything, it is that some reckonings cannot be avoided forever. Some truths refuse to remain buried. Some fires never truly go out. And sometimes, in the darkest hours of the night, justice finds its way to those who thought they had escaped it, in forms they never anticipated, from directions they never thought to guard against, with a patience that transcends the limitations of time and mortality. In the quiet darkness of your room, as you consider this story, perhaps take a moment to listen to the silence around you. Is it truly empty, or might there be something there? Some presence just beyond perception, some justice still seeking completion, some fire still burning without consuming. Sleep well. And if you wake in the night to find your room unusually warm, if you catch the faint scent of smoke and kerosene where none should exist, if you feel watched by eyes you cannot see, remember the Sundown Motel. Remember Room 17. Remember that some cases are never truly closed, some debts never fully settled, some fires never completely extinguished. And perhaps, most importantly, remember that in the end, as Richard Mitchell discovered on a Christmas Eve long ago, we all eventually check into rooms of our own making, spaces constructed from our actions, our choices, our secrets, and our truths. What room awaits you? What might be waiting inside? The answer lies in actions taken and choices made, in the spaces we create for ourselves and others through how we live, how we treat those around us, and how we face the consequences of our darkest deeds. Turn to God, turn to Jesus Christ. For in the face of such darkness, only divine light can truly guide us away from the rooms we build in shadow, from the fires that burn without consuming, from the justice that reaches beyond the grave. The case of the Sundown Motel is solved. But perhaps, in another sense, it continues, not just in Bakersfield, not just in Room 17 or in the hospital room where Richard Mitchell faced his final moments, but wherever truth emerges from darkness, wherever justice finds its path through time, wherever actions create consequences that cannot be escaped. Listen closely to the silence. Watch the shadows in the corners of your room. Feel the temperature of the air against your skin. And remember that some stories, once begun, write their own endings, in ways we might never expect, but perhaps in the deepest recesses of our consciences, always feared might come to pass. Some fires never go out, some rooms never empty, some justice never ends. Sleep well,